Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects by Giorgio Vasari.
Life of Giuliano and Antonio da Sangallo, Architects of Florence. Francesco di Paolo Giamberti, who was a passing good architect in the time of Cosimo de' Medici, and was much employed by him, had two sons, Giuliano and Antonio, whom he apprenticed to the art of wood carving. One of these two sons, Giuliano, he placed with Francione, a joiner, an ingenious person who gave attention at the same time to wood carving and to perspective, and with whom Francesco was very intimate, since they had executed many works in company, both in carving and in architecture, for Lorenzo de Medici. This Giuliano learned so well all that Francione taught him, that the carvings and beautiful perspectives that he afterwards executed by himself in the choir of the Duomo of Pisa are still regarded not without marvel at the present day, even among the many new perspectives. While Giuliano was studying design, and his young blood ran hot in his veins, the army of the Duke of Calabria, by reason of the hatred which that lord bore to Lorenzo de' Medici, encamped before Castellina in order to occupy the dominions of the Signoria of Florence, and also, if this could be successful, in order to accomplish some greater design. Wherefore Lorenzo the Magnificent was forced to send an engineer to Castellina, who might make mills and bastions, and should have the charge of handling the artillery, which few men at that time were able to do, and he sent thither Giuliano, considering him to have a mind more able, more ready, and more resolute than any other man, and knowing him already as the son of Francesco, who had been a devoted servant of the house of Medici. Arriving at Castellina, therefore, Giuliano fortified that place with good walls and mills, both within and without, and furnished it with everything else necessary for the defence. Then, observing that the artillerymen stood at a great distance from their pieces, handling, loading, and discharging them with much timidity, he gave his attention to this, and so contrived that from that time onwards the artillery did harm to no one, whereas it had previously killed many of them, since they had not had judgment and knowledge enough to avoid suffering injury from the recoil. Having therefore taken charge of the artillery, Giuliano showed great skill in discharging it to the best possible advantage, and the Duke's forces so lost heart by reason of this and other adverse circumstances that they were glad to make terms and to part from the town. In consequence of this, Giuliano won no little praise from Lorenzo in Florence, and was looked upon with favour and affection ever afterwards. Having meanwhile given his attention to architecture, he began the first cloister of the monastery of Cestello, and executed that part of it that is seen to be of the Ionic order, placing capitals on the columns with volutes curving downwards to the collarino, where the shaft of the column ends, and making below the ovoli and the fusarole a frieze, 1/3 in height of the diameter of the column. This capital was copied from a very ancient one of marble found at Fiesole by Messer Leonardo Salutati, bishop of that place, who kept it for some time together with other antiquities in a house and garden that he occupied in the Via de San Gallo, opposite Santa Agata, and it is now in the possession of Messer Battista da Ricasoli, bishop of Pistoia, and is prized for its beauty and variety, since among the ancient capitals there has not been seen another like it. But that cloister remained unfinished, because those monks were not then able to bear such an expense. Meanwhile, Giuliano had come into even greater credit with Lorenzo, and the latter, who was intending to build a palace at Poggio a Caggiano, a place between Florence and Pistoia, and had caused several models to be made for it by Francione and by others, commissioned Giuliano also to make one of the sort of building that he proposed to erect. And Giuliano made it so completely different in form from the others, and so much to Lorenzo's fancy, that he began straightway to have it carried into execution as the best of all the models, on which account he took Giuliano even more into his favour, and ever afterwards gave him an allowance. After this, Giuliano, wishing to make a vaulted ceiling for the great hall of that palace in the manner that we call barrel-shaped, Lorenzo could not believe, on account of the great space, that it could be raised. Whereupon Giuliano, who was building a house for himself in Florence, made a ceiling for his hall, according to the design of the other, in order to convince the mind of the magnificent prince, and Lorenzo therefore gave orders for the ceiling at the Poggio to be carried out, which was successfully done. By that time the fame of Giuliano had so increased that at the entreaty of the Duke of Calabria he was commissioned by Lorenzo the Magnificent to make the model of a palace that was to be built at Naples, and he spent a long time over executing it. Now, while he was working at this, the Castellan of Ostia, then Bishop della Rovere, who after a time became Pope Julius II, wishing to restore that stronghold and to put it into good order, and having heard the fame of Giuliano, sent to Florence for him, and having supplied him with a good provision, he kept him employed for 2 years in making therein all the useful improvements that he was able to execute by means of his art. And to the end that the model for the Duke of Calabria might not be neglected, but might be brought to conclusion, he left it to his brother Antonio, who finished it according to his directions, which in executing it and carrying it to completion he followed with great diligence, for he was no less competent in that art than Giuliano himself. Now Giuliano was advised by the elder Lorenzo to present it in person, to the end that he might show from the model itself the difficulties that he had triumphed over in making it. Whereupon he departed for Naples, and having presented the work, was received with honour, for men were as much impressed by the gracious manner in which the magnificent Lorenzo had sent him, as they were struck with marvel at the masterly work in the model, which gave such satisfaction that the building was straightway begun near the Castel Nuovo. After Giuliano had been some time in Naples, he sought leave from the Duke to return to Florence, whereupon he was presented by the king with horses and garments, and among other things with a silver cup containing some hundreds of ducats. These things Giuliano would not accept, saying that he served a patron who had no need of silver or gold, but that if he did indeed wish to give him some present or some token of approbation to show that he had been in that city, he might bestow upon him some of his antiquities, which he would choose himself. These the king granted to him most liberally, both for love of the magnificent Lorenzo and on account of Giuliano's own worth, and they were a head of the Emperor Hadrian, which is now above the door of the garden at the house of the Medici, a nude woman more than life size, and a Cupid sleeping, all in marble and in the round. Giuliano sent them as presents to the magnificent Lorenzo, who expressed vast delight at the gift, and never tired of praising the action of this most liberal of craftsmen, who had refused gold and silver for the sake of art, a thing which few would have done. That Cupid is now in the guardaroba of Duke Cosimo. Having then returned to Florence, Giuliano was received most graciously by the magnificent Lorenzo. Now the fancy had taken that prince to build a convent capable of holding 100 friars without the Porta San Gallo, in order to give satisfaction to Frater Mariano da Ginazzano, a most learned member of the order of Eremite friars of St. Augustine. For this convent models were made by many architects, and in the end that of Giuliano was put into execution, which was the reason that Lorenzo from this work gave him the name Giuliano da Sangallo. Wherefore Giuliano, who heard himself called by everyone da Sangallo, said one day in jest to the magnificent Lorenzo, "By giving me this new name of da Sangallo, you are making me lose the ancient name of my house, so that in place of going forward in the matter of lineage, as I thought to do, I am going backward." Whereupon Lorenzo answered that he would rather have him become the founder of a new house through his own worth than depend on others, at which Giuliano was well content. Meanwhile the work of San Gallo was carried on, together with Lorenzo's other buildings, but neither the convent nor the others were finished by reason of the death of Lorenzo, and even the completed part of this structure of San Gallo did not long remain standing, because in 1530, on account of the siege of Florence, it was destroyed and thrown to the ground, together with the whole suburb, the piazza of which was completely surrounded by very beautiful buildings, and at the present day there is no trace to be seen there of house, church, or convent. At this time there took place the death of the King of Naples, whereupon Giuliano Gondi, a very rich Florentine merchant, returned from that city to Florence, and commissioned Giuliano da Sangallo, with whom he had become very intimate on account of his visit to Naples, to build him a palace in rustic work opposite the San Firenze, above the place where the lions used to be. This palace was to form the angle of the piazza and to face the old Mercatanza, but the death of Giuliano Gondi put a stop to the work. In it, among other things, Giuliano made a chimney piece very rich in carvings and so varied and beautiful in composition that up to that time there had never been seen the like, nor one with such a wealth of figures. The same master made a palace for a Venetian in Camerata, without the Porta a Pinti, and many houses of private citizens, of which there is no need to make mention. Lorenzo the Magnificent, in order to benefit the commonwealth and adorn the state, and at the same time to leave behind him some splendid monument in addition to the endless number that he had already erected, wished to execute the fortification of the Poggio Imperiale above Poggibonsi on the road to Rome, with a view to founding a city there, and he would not lay it out without the advice and design of Giuliano. Wherefore that master began the most famous structure, in which he made the well-designed and beautiful range of fortifications that we see at the present day. These works brought him such fame that he was then summoned to Milan, through the mediation of Lorenzo, by the Duke of Milan, to the end that he might make for him the model of a palace, and there Giuliano was no less honoured by the Duke than he had previously been honoured by the King of Naples, when that sovereign had invited him to that city. For when he had presented the model to him on the part of the magnificent Lorenzo, the Duke was filled with astonishment and marvel at seeing the vast number of beautiful adornments in it, so well arranged and distributed, and all accommodated in their places with art and grace. For which reason all the materials necessary for the work were got together, and they began to put it into execution. In the same city, together with Giuliano, was Leonardo da Vinci, who was working for the Duke, and Leonardo, speaking with Giuliano about the casting of the horse that he was proposing to make, received from him some excellent suggestions. This work was broken to pieces on the arrival of the French, so that the horse was never finished, nor could the palace be brought to completion. Having returned to Florence, Giuliano found that his brother Antonio, who worked for him on his models, had become so excellent that there was no one in his day who was a better master in carving, particularly for large crucifixes of wood, to which witness is borne by the one over the high altar of the Nunziata in Florence, by another that is kept by the friars of San Gallo in San Jacopo tra Fossi, and by a third in the company of the Scalzo, which are all held to be very good. But Giuliano removed him from that profession and caused him to give his attention to architecture, in company with himself, since he had many works to execute, both public and private. Now it happened, as it is always happening, that fortune, the enemy of talent, robbed the followers of the arts of their hope and support by the death of Lorenzo de Medici, which was a heavy loss not only to all able craftsmen and to his country, but also to all Italy. Wherefore Giuliano, together with all the other lofty spirits, was left wholly inconsolable, and in his grief he betook himself to Prato near Florence, in order to build the temple of the Madonna delle Carcere, since all building in Florence, both public and private, was at a standstill. He lived in Prato, therefore, 3 whole years, supporting the expense, discomfort, and sorrow as best he could. At the end of that time, it being proposed to roof the church of the Madonna at Loreto, and to raise the cupola, which had been formerly begun but not finished by Giuliano da Maiano, and those who had charge of the matter doubting that the piers were too weak to bear such a weight, they wrote therefore to Giuliano that if he desired such a work, he should go and see it for himself. And having gone, like the bold and able man that he was, he showed them that the cupola could be raised with ease, and that he had courage enough for the task, and so many and of such a kind were the reasons that he put before them that the work was allotted to him. After receiving this commission, he caused the work in Prato to be dispatched, and made his way with the same master builders and stone cutters to Loreto. And to the end that this structure, besides beauty of form, might be firm, solid, stable, and well bound to the stonework, he sent to Rome for pozzolana, a friable volcanic tufa, nor was any lime used that was not mixed with it, nor any stone built in without it. And thus, within the space of 3 years, it was brought to perfect completion, ready for use. Giuliano then went to Rome, where, for Pope Alexander VI, he restored the roof of Santa Maria Maggiore, which was falling into ruin, and he made there the ceiling that is to be seen at the present day. While he was thus employed about the court, Bishop della Rovere, who had been the friend of Giuliano from the time when he was Castellan of Ostia, and who had been created Cardinal of San Pietro in Vincula, caused him to make a model for the Palace of San Pietro in Vincula, and a little time after, desiring to build a palace in his own city of Savona, he wished to have it erected likewise from the design and under the eye of Giuliano. But such a journey was difficult for Giuliano, for the reason that his ceiling was not yet finished, and Pope Alexander would not let him go. He entrusted the finishing of it, therefore, to his brother Antonio, who, having a good and versatile intelligence, and coming thus into contact with the court, entered into the service of the Pope, who conceived a very great affection for him, and this he proved when he resolved to restore with new foundations and with defences, after the manner of a castle, the mausoleum of Hadrian, now called the Castello di Sant'Angelo. For Antonio was made overseer of this undertaking, and under his direction were made the great towers below, the ditches, and the rest of the fortifications that we see at the present day. This work brought him great credit with the Pope and with his son, Duke Valentino, and it led to his building the fortress that is now to be seen at Civita Castellana. Thus, then, while that pontiff was alive, he was continually employed in building, and while working for him, he was rewarded by him no less than he was esteemed. Giuliano had already carried well forward the work at Savona, when the Cardinal returned to Rome on some business of his own, leaving many workmen to bring the building to completion after the directions and design of Giuliano, whom he took with him to Rome. Giuliano made that journey willingly, wishing to see Antonio and his works, and he stayed there some months. During that time, however, the Cardinal fell in disgrace with the Pope, and departed from Rome in order not to be taken prisoner, and Giuliano, as before, went in his company. On arriving at Savona, they set a much greater number of master builders and other artificers to work on the building. But the threats of the Pope against the Cardinal becoming every day louder, it was not long before he made his way to Avignon. From there he sent as a present to the King of France a model for the palace that Giuliano had made for him, which was marvellous, very rich in ornament, and spacious enough for the accommodation of his whole court. The royal court was at Lyons, where Giuliano presented his model, and the gift was so welcome and acceptable to the king that he rewarded Giuliano liberally, and gave him infinite praise, besides rendering many thanks for it to the Cardinal, who was at Avignon. Meanwhile, they received news that the palace at Savona was already nearly finished, whereupon the Cardinal determined that Giuliano should once more see the work, and Giuliano, having gone for this purpose to Savona, had not been there long when it was completely finished. Then, desiring to return to Florence, where he had not been for a long time, Giuliano took the road for that city, together with his master builders. Now at that time the King of France had restored Pisa her liberty, and the war between the Florentines and the Pisans was still raging, and Giuliano, wishing to pass through Pisan territory, had a safe conduct made out for his company at Lucca, for they had no small apprehension about the Pisan soldiers. Nevertheless, while passing near Alto Passio, they were captured by the Pisans, who cared nothing for safe conducts or for any other warrant that they might have, and for 6 months Giuliano was detained in Pisa, his ransom being fixed at 300 ducats, nor was he able to return to Florence until he had paid it. Antonio had heard this news in Rome, and desiring to see his native city and his brother again, obtained leave to depart from Rome, and on his way he designed for Duke Valentino the fortress of Montefiascone. Finally, in the year 1503, he reached Florence, where the two brothers and their friends took joyful pleasure in each other's company. There now ensued the death of Alexander VI and the election of Pius III, who lived but a short time, whereupon the Cardinal of San Pietro in Vincoli was created pontiff under the name of Pope Julius II, which brought great joy to Giuliano on account of his having been so long in his service, and he determined therefore to go to kiss the Pope's foot. Having then arrived in Rome, he was warmly received and welcomed lovingly, and was straightway commissioned to execute the first buildings undertaken by that pope after the coming of Bramante. Antonio, who had remained in Florence, continued in the absence of Giuliano, Piero Soderini being gonfaloniere, the building of the Poggio Imperiale, to which all the Pisan prisoners were sent to labor in order to finish the work the quicker. After this, by reason of the troubles at Arezzo, the old fortress was destroyed, and Antonio made the model for the new one with the consent of Giuliano, who had come from Rome for this purpose, but soon returned thither, and this work was the reason that Antonio was appointed architect to the Commune of Florence for all the fortifications. On the return of Giuliano to Rome, the question was being debated as to whether the divine Michelangelo Buonarroti should make the tomb of Pope Julius, whereupon Giuliano exhorted the Pope to pursue that undertaking, adding that it seemed to him that it was necessary to build a special chapel for such a monument, and that it should not be placed in the old San Pietro, in which there was no space for it, whereas a new chapel would bring out all the perfection of the work. After many architects then had made designs, the matter, little by little, became one of such importance that in place of erecting a chapel, a beginning was made with the great fabric of the new San Pietro. There had arrived in Rome about that time the architect Bramante of Castel Durante, who had been in Lombardy, and he went to work in such a manner, with various extraordinary means and methods of his own, and with his fantastic ideas, having on his side Baldassare Peruzzi, Raffaello da Urbino, and other architects, that he put the whole undertaking into confusion, whereby much time was consumed in discussions. Finally, so well did he know how to set about the matter, the work was entrusted to him as the man who had shown the finest judgment, the best intelligence, and the greatest invention. Giuliano resenting this, for it appeared to him that he had received an affront from the Pope, in view of the faithful service that he had rendered to him when his rank was not so high, and of the promise made to him by the Pope that he should have that building, sought leave to go, and so, notwithstanding that he was appointed companion to Bramante for other edifices that were being erected in Rome, he departed and returned with many gifts received from that pontiff to Florence. This was a great joy to Piero Soderini, who straightway set him to work. Nor had 6 months gone by when Messer Bartolomeo della Rovere, the nephew of the Pope and a friend of Giuliano, wrote to him in the name of His Holiness that he should return for his own advantage to Rome. But neither terms nor promises availed to move Giuliano, who considered that he had been put to shame by the Pope. Finally, however, a letter was written to Piero Soderini, urging him in one way or another to send Giuliano to Rome, since His Holiness wished to finish the fortifications of the great round tower which had been begun by Nicholas V, and likewise those of the Borgo and the Belvedere, with other works. And Giuliano allowed himself to be persuaded by Soderini, and therefore went to Rome, where he received a gracious welcome and many gifts from the Pope. Having afterwards gone to Bologna, from which the Bentivogli had just been driven out, the Pope resolved, by the advice of Giuliano, to have a figure of himself in bronze made by Michelangelo Buonarroti, and this was carried out, as will be related in the life of Michelangelo himself. Giuliano also followed the Pope to Mirandola, and after it was taken, having endured much fatigue and many discomforts, he returned with the court to Rome. But the furious desire to drive the French out of Italy, not having yet got out of the head of the Pope, he strove to wrest the government of Florence out of the hands of Piero Soderini, whose power was no small hindrance to him in the project that he had in mind. Whereupon, since the pontiff for these reasons had turned aside from building and had embroiled himself in wars, Giuliano, by this time weary and perceiving that attention was being given only to the construction of San Pietro, and not much even to that, sought leave from him to depart. But the Pope answered him in anger. "Do you believe that you are the only Giuliano da Sangallo to be found?" To which he replied that none could be found equal to him in faithful service, while he himself could easily find princes truer to their promises than the Pope had been toward him. However, the pontiff would by no means give him leave to go, saying that he would speak to him about it another time. Meanwhile, Bramante, having brought Raffaello da Urbino to Rome, set him to work at painting the papal apartments, whereupon Giuliano, perceiving that the Pope took great delight in those pictures, and knowing that he wished to have the ceiling of the chapel of his uncle Sixtus painted, spoke to him of Michelangelo, adding that he had already executed the bronze statue in Bologna, which news pleased the Pope so much that he sent for Michelangelo, who, on arriving in Rome, received the commission for the painting of that chapel. A little time after this, Giuliano, coming back once more to seek leave from the Pope to depart, His Holiness, seeing him determined on this, was content that he should return to Florence without forfeiting his favour, and after having blessed him, he gave him a purse of red satin containing 500 crowns, telling him that he might return home to rest, but that he would always be his friend. Giuliano then, having kissed the sacred foot, returned to Florence at the very time when Pisa was surrounded and besieged by the army of Florence. No sooner had he arrived, therefore, than Piero Soderini, after the due greetings, sent him to the camp to help the military commissaries, who had found themselves unable to prevent the Pisans from passing provisions into Pisa by way of the Arno. Giuliano made a design for a bridge of boats to be built at some better season, and then went back to Florence, and when spring had come, taking with him his brother Antonio, he made his way to Pisa, where they constructed a bridge, which was a very ingenious piece of work, since, beside the fact that rising or falling with the water, and being well bound with chains, it stood safe and sound against floods, it carried out the desires of the commissaries in such a manner, cutting off Pisa from access to the sea by way of the Arno, that the Pisans, having no other expedient in their sore straits, were forced to come to terms with the Florentines, and so they surrendered. Nor was it long before the same Piero Soderini again sent Giuliano with a vast number of master builders to Pisa, where with extraordinary swiftness he erected the fortress that still stands at the Porta a San Marco, and also the gate itself, which he built in the Doric order. And the while that Giuliano was engaged on this work, which was until the year 1512, Antonio went through the whole dominion, inspecting and restoring the fortresses and other public buildings. After this, by the favour of the same Pope Julius, the house of Medici was reinstated in the government of Florence, from which they had been driven out on the invasion of Italy by Charles VIII, King of France, and Piero Soderini was expelled from the palace, and the Medici showed their gratitude to Giuliano and Antonio for the services that they had rendered in the past to their illustrious family. Now Cardinal Giovanni de Medici, having been elected Pope a short time after the death of Julius II, Giuliano was forced once again to betake himself to Rome, where, Bramante dying not long after his arrival, it was proposed to give to Giuliano the charge of the building of San Pietro. But he, being worn out by his labours, and crushed down by old age, and by the stone, which made his life a burden, returned by leave of His Holiness to Florence, and that commission was given to the most gracious Raffaello da Urbino, and Giuliano, after 2 years, was pressed so sorely by his malady that he died at the age of 74 in the year 1517, leaving his name to the world, his body to the earth, and his soul to God. By his departure he left a heavy burden of sorrow to his brother Antonio, who loved him tenderly, and to a son of his named Francesco, who was engaged in sculpture, although he was still quite young. This Francesco, who has preserved up to our own day all the treasures of his elders and holds them in veneration, executed many works at Florence and elsewhere, both in sculpture and in architecture, and by his hand is the Madonna of marble, with the Child in her arms and lying in the lap of St. Anne, that is in Orsan Michele, which work, with the figures carved in the round out of one single block, was held, as it still is, to be very beautiful. He has also executed the tomb that Pope Clement caused to be made for Piero de' Medici at Monte Cassino, besides many other works of which no mention is here made, because the said Francesco is still alive. After the death of Giuliano, Antonio, being a man who was not willing to stay idle, made 2 large crucifixes of wood, one of which was sent into Spain, while the other, by order of the Vice-Chancellor, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, was taken by Domenico Buoninsegni into France. It was then proposed to build the fortress of Livorno. Antonio was sent thither by Cardinal de' Medici to make the design for it, which he did, although it was afterwards not carried completely into execution, nor even after the method suggested by Antonio. After this, the men of Montepulciano, determining by reason of the miracles wrought by an image of Our Lady to build a temple for it at very great costs, Antonio made the model for this, and became head of the undertaking, on which account he visited that building twice a year. At the present day it is to be seen carried to perfect completion, having been executed with supreme grace and with truly marvellous beauty and variety of composition by the genius of Antonio, and all the masonry is of a certain stone that has a tinge of white, after the manner of travertine. It stands without the Porta di San Biagio, on the right hand, halfway up the slope of the hill. At this time he made a beginning with a palace in the township of Monte San Sovino for Antonio di Monte, Cardinal of Santa Prasedia, and he built another for the same man at Montepulciano, both being executed and finished with extraordinary grace. He made the design for the side of the buildings for the Servite friars in Florence, and on their piazza, following the order of the Loggia of the Innocenti, and at Arezzo he made models for the aisles of the Madonna delle Lacrime, although that work was very badly conceived, because it is out of harmony with the original part of the building, and the arches at the ends are not in true line with the centre. He also made a model for the Madonna of Cortona, but I do not think that this was put into execution. He was employed in the siege on the bastions and fortifications within the city, and in this undertaking he had as a companion his nephew Francesco. After this, the giant of the piazza, executed by the hand of Michelagnolo, having been set into place in the time of Giuliano, the brother of our Antonio, it was proposed to set up the other, which had been made by Baccio Bandinelli, and the task of bringing it safely into position was given to Antonio, who, taking Baccio d'Agnolo as his companion, carried this out by means of very powerful machines, and placed it in safety on the base that had been prepared for that purpose. In the end, having become old, he took no pleasure in anything save agriculture, of which he had an excellent knowledge. And then, when on account of old age he was no longer able to bear the discomforts of this world, he rendered up his soul to God in the year 1534, and was laid to rest by the side of his brother Giuliano in the tomb of the Giamberti in the church of Santa Maria Novella. The marvellous works of these 2 brothers will bear witness before the world to the extraordinary genius that they possessed, and for their lives, their honourable ways, and their every action, they were held in estimation by all men. Giuliano and Antonio bequeathed to the art of architecture methods that gave the Tuscan order of building better form than any other architect had yet achieved, and the Doric order they enriched with better measures and proportions than their predecessors, following the rules and canons of Vitruvius, had been wont to use. They collected in their houses at Florence an infinite number of most beautiful antiquities in marble, which adorned Florence and still adorn her, no less than those masters honoured themselves and their art. Giuliano brought from Rome the method of casting vaults, with such materials as made them ready carved, examples of which may be seen in a room in his own house, and in the vaulting of the great hall at Poggio a Caggiano, which is still to be seen there. Wherefore we should acknowledge our obligation to their labours, whereby they fortified the dominion of Florence, adorned the city, and gave a name throughout the many regions where they worked, to Florence and to the intellects of Tuscany, who to honour their memory have written to them these verses: Cedite Romani structores, cedite graii artis, Vitruvi tu quoque ceri parens, Etruscos celebrare viros, testudinis arcus, urna, tolus, statuae, templa, domusque petunt.